Tony Delucci thought he was untouchable. Then he made one mistake that would haunt him forever. He insulted Bumpy Johnson's mother. Before we get into what happened next, make sure to hit that subscribe button and smash the like. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, what Bumpy did to Tony was so brutal. Even the police felt sorry for him. Harlem in 1952 was a world unto itself. A place where power didn't come from badges or political offices. It came from respect, fear, and the careful balance between the two. And at the center of that world stood Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, a man whose very name could silence a crowded room. But if you wanted to understand real power in Harlem, you didn't just need to know about Bumpy. You needed to know about his mother. Mame Johnson wasn't a mobster. She wasn't a criminal. She was a church-going woman who lived in a modest apartment on 139th Street, who baked sweet potato pies for the neighborhood kids and volunteered at the local food kitchen every Thursday. But she was Bumpy Johnson's mother, and that made her the most protected person in all of New York City. It wasn't just that Bumpy loved his mother, though he did, with a devotion that seemed almost out of place for a man of his reputation. It was that he had made it abundantly clear, through both words and actions, that disrespecting her was the one unforgivable sin in his kingdom. The rules of Harlem were simple, and everyone knew them. You could run numbers, you could bootleg. You could even settle disputes with your fists if it came to that. But you showed respect where respect was due. You didn't involve civilians in business. You didn't hurt women or children. And under absolutely no circumstances did you say a crossword about, to, or near Bumpy Johnson's mother. These weren't written rules. They didn't need to be. They were understood the way gravity is understood. You didn't test it because the consequences were certain. Bumpy had built his empire on calculated violence and strategic alliances. He'd survived wars with Dutch Schultz, negotiations with Lucky Luciano, and decades in a business where most men didn't last 5 years. He was known for being reasonable, for being a man you could talk to, even negotiate with. But when it came to his mother, there was no negotiation, no conversation, no second chances. It was the one line that couldn't be uncrossed. Everyone in Harlem knew this. Everyone in the Italian mob knew this. Everyone except Tony Delucci knew this. And that ignorance was about to cost him everything. Tony Delucci arrived in New York in the spring of 1952 with big ambitions and an even bigger mouth. He was a made man from the Genovese family, sent from Philadelphia to help expand their operations into Harlem's lucrative numbers racket. At 28 years old, Tony had already earned a reputation for being ruthless and effective. He'd handled collections, managed territory disputes, wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty when the situation called for it. But Philadelphia wasn't New York, and the Genovese family's territory wasn't Harlem. Tony saw Harlem as an opportunity, a gold mine waiting to be claimed by someone bold enough to take it. He looked at Bumpy Johnson's operation and saw what he thought was weakness, an aging gangster who'd gone soft, who spent more time playing chess in the park than enforcing his territory. Tony had heard the stories about Bumpy's glory days. But stories were just stories. This was 1952, and Tony believed it was time for new blood to take over. From the moment he set foot in Harlem, Tony made it clear he wasn't there to ask permission. He started shaking down local businesses that were under Bumpy's protection, telling them the Italians were in charge now. He recruited runners from Bumpy's own operation, offering them better percentages and promising them protection from any retaliation. When some of Bumpy's associates tried to have a conversation with him, tried to explain how things worked in Harlem, Tony laughed in their faces. He told them the days of Negro gangsters running anything were over. The warnings came quickly. First, from the street-level guys who worked for Bumpy, then from more serious players, and finally from some of the Italian old-timers who understood the delicate balance that kept the peace between the families and Harlem's independent operators. They all told Tony the same thing: slow down, show respect, and for the love of God, stay away from anything connected to Bumpy's mother. But Tony saw these warnings as signs of fear, proof that he was winning. He was too arrogant to understand that sometimes warnings aren't threats. Sometimes they're mercy. Okay? And sometimes, when you ignore enough warnings, mercy runs out. Tony was about to learn that lesson in the hardest way possible. The collision course was set, and everyone in Harlem could see it coming, except the one man who needed to see it most. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late June. Outside the grocery store on Lenox Avenue, where Bumpy's mother shopped every week. The weather was hot and humid, the kind of day where the whole neighborhood moved slowly, conserving energy in the oppressive heat. Mame Johnson had just finished her shopping and was walking to her car, moving carefully with 2 bags of groceries in her arms. She was 72 years old, a dignified woman in a floral print dress and white gloves. The picture of respectability. Tony Delucci was parked across the street with 2 of his associates, watching one of Bumpy's collection spots. When he saw her, didn't know who she was at first. He just saw an elderly black woman struggling with grocery bags, and in his arrogance and stupidity, he saw an opportunity to make a point. He stepped out of his car and walked directly into her path, deliberately blocking her way on the sidewalk. "Move it," Tony said, his voice loud enough for everyone on the street to hear. "Some of us got places to be." Mame looked up at him, confused. She started to step aside, trying to go around him, but Tony moved with her, continuing to block her path. His associates were laughing now, encouraging him. The street had gone quiet. People who'd been walking stopped. Store owners came to their doorways. Everyone who saw what was happening felt their blood run cold because they knew exactly who this woman was. And they knew what was about to happen. "I said move, old woman," Tony continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "Go back to whatever church you crawled out of and stop blocking the sidewalk. This is business territory now." One of the local shop owners, a man named Jerome Hood, known Mame for 30 years, stepped forward. "Sir, please, you don't understand who I don't care who she is," Tony cut him off. "She's in my way, and I'm tired of you people thinking you own these streets." Then Tony did the unthinkable. He reached out and shoved Mame's shoulder. Not hard enough to knock her down, but hard enough to make her stumble. One of her grocery bags fell, oranges rolling across the sidewalk. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Tony's associates had stopped laughing. Mame steadied herself, looked at Tony with an expression that somehow mixed pity with dignity, and quietly bent down to gather her spilled groceries. 3 people rushed to help her. Nobody said a word to Tony. They didn't need to. Within 10 minutes, word of what had happened had reached every corner of Harlem. Within 15 minutes, it reached Bumpy Johnson. And in that moment, Tony Delucci's fate was sealed. He just didn't know it yet. Bumpy Johnson was playing chess in Marcus Garvey Park when he got the news. A young runner named Samuel came sprinting across the grass, out of breath and clearly terrified to be the messenger. Bumpy was in the middle of a game with an old friend, contemplating his next move, when Samuel arrived and whispered in his ear. For a long moment, Bumpy didn't move. His hand hovered over a chess piece, frozen in midair. Then, slowly, he lowered his hand and looked up. "Say that again," Bumpy said quietly. Samuel repeated what had happened, describing the scene outside the grocery store. Tony's words, the push, the spilled groceries. As he spoke, Bumpy's expression didn't change. There was no visible anger, no raised voice, no sudden movement. But everyone who knew Bumpy understood that this was more dangerous than any rage. This was the calm before a hurricane. Bumpy stood up from the chess table, buttoned his jacket, and straightened his tie. He looked at his chess opponent and said simply, "I need to take care of something. We'll finish this game another time." Bumpy's first stop was his mother's apartment. He needed to see her to make sure she was truly okay. When he arrived, he found her in her kitchen, calm as ever, preparing dinner as if nothing had happened. She saw the look in her son's eyes and knew immediately why he was there. "I'm fine, Ellsworth," she said, using his given name like she always did. "It was just some confused young man who doesn't know any better." "Mama, did he put his hands on you?" Bumpy asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "He pushed my shoulder. I dropped my groceries. But people helped me, and I'm fine now. You don't need to do anything about this." But Bumpy wasn't hearing her. In his mind, the response was already taking shape. This wasn't about revenge. This was about order. This was about maintaining the one sacred rule that kept his world functioning. If Tony Delucci could disrespect his mother and walk away unscathed, then everything Bumpy had built meant nothing. Every agreement, every understanding, every careful balance of power would collapse. After leaving his mother's apartment, Bumpy made a series of phone calls. He called associates in the Italian mob, not to ask permission, but to inform them of what was about to happen and why. Some of them tried to negotiate on Tony's behalf, offering to send him back to Philadelphia to make financial restitution. Anything to avoid what they knew was coming. Bumpy listened politely to each offer and declined them all. This wasn't about money or territory. This was about respect. By nightfall, Bumpy had assembled a team and laid out his plan. The punishment needed to be public enough to send a message, but controlled enough to avoid a loud war with the Italian families. It needed to be severe enough that no one would ever make this mistake again. And most importantly, it needed to make Tony Delucci understand exactly what he'd done and why what was about to happen to him was inevitable. As Bumpy explained his plan to his most trusted men, even they, hardened criminals who'd seen everything, exchanged nervous glances. What Bumpy had in mind was going to be legendary. They came for Tony Delucci at 3 a.m. He was asleep in his apartment on the Lower East Side, dreaming whatever dreams arrogant men dream, when 6 of Bumpy's men kicked in his door. Tony reached for the gun he kept under his pillow, but before his fingers could close around it, he was dragged from his bed and thrown to the floor. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. Tony knew exactly why they were there. They drove him to Harlem, to a warehouse on 145th Street that Bumpy owned. When they brought Tony inside, he saw Bumpy sitting in a chair in the center of the empty space, perfectly calm, his suit immaculate, even at this hour. Around him stood at least 20 men, and in the corner, sitting on folding chairs like they were attending a theater performance, were some of the most powerful figures in Harlem's underworld. This wasn't going to be a private punishment. This was going to be a lesson. "Do you know why you're here, Tony?" Bumpy asked. Tony, trying to maintain some dignity despite being in his undershirt and pants, attempted defiance. "This is a mistake. Bumpy, I'm with the Genovese family." "You can't just—" "I asked you a question," Bumpy interrupted, his voice still quiet. "Do you know why you're here?" Something in Bumpy's tone made Tony's bravado crumble. "The old woman?" he said. "I didn't know she was your mother. Nobody told me." "Everybody told you," Bumpy said, standing up now. "You were warned to stay away. From my family, you were warned to show respect. You were warned that there were lines you couldn't cross. But you didn't listen. You thought you were above the rules. You thought being Italian made you special. What happened next was methodical and terrifying in its precision." Bumpy didn't lay a hand on Tony himself. He didn't need to. For the next 6 hours, Tony was subjected to a punishment that was designed not to kill him, but to break him completely. They started by stripping him down and making him kneel on the concrete floor. Then, one by one, members of the community. Tony had disrespected store owners he'd shaken down, cute numbers, runners he'd threatened, cute regular people whose lives he'd disrupted, came forward to spit on him. But the physical humiliation was just the beginning. Bumpy had done his research on Tony. He knew about Tony's wife back in Philadelphia, his 2 young daughters, his aging father who ran a restaurant in South Philly. And Bumpy made it clear, in excruciating detail, how easy it would be to extend Tony's punishment to everyone he loved. He didn't threaten to actually do it. Bumpy didn't hurt innocent people. But the fear of what could happen was almost worse than any physical pain. They kept Tony in that warehouse as the sun came up. As morning turned to afternoon. They didn't beat him unconscious or break his bones. Instead, they made him understand, hour after hour, the magnitude of his mistake. They made him repeat, over and over, what he'd done to Bumpy's mother. They made him describe it in detail until his voice was hoarse. And through it all, Bumpy sat in his chair, watching with those cold, calculating eyes, occasionally asking questions, always in control. By the time Bumpy's men dumped Tony on the steps of the 6th Precinct police station at 4 o'clock that afternoon, it was barely recognizable. He wasn't bloody or broken in the traditional sense. No shattered bones, no cuts requiring stitches. But something in him had been fundamentally destroyed. He was crying uncontrollably, shaking, muttering to himself when the desk sergeant first saw him. He thought they were dealing with a drunk or someone having a mental breakdown. It took 2 hours before they could get a coherent statement from Tony about what had happened. When he finally told them about the warehouse, about the humiliation, about the psychological torture that Bumpy had orchestrated, the officers exchanged uncomfortable looks. They knew they had to investigate. They knew they had to, at least, go through the motions. But even the most hardened cops in the precinct, men who'd seen victims of mob violence their entire careers, felt an uncomfortable pang of sympathy for Tony Delucci. Detective Mike O'Sullivan, a 20-year veteran who'd been dealing with mob cases since the 1930s, was assigned to the case. He went to the warehouse with a team, but of course, it was clean. No evidence of what had happened, no witnesses willing to talk. He interviewed Tony multiple times, and each interview was harder to watch than the last. Tony wasn't angry or defiant. He was terrified. He kept asking if they could protect him, if they could keep Bumpy away from his family. "What exactly did they do to you?" O'Sullivan asked during one interview. "Did they break anything? Burn you? What physical injuries do you have?" Tony shook his head. "You don't understand. It wasn't about physical pain. He got inside my head. He made me see what could happen. He made me understand." Tony's voice trailed off, and he started crying again. O'Sullivan had seen mob hits, beatings, torture. He'd scraped bodies off sidewalks and investigated murders that would give most people nightmares. But there was something about Tony's complete psychological collapse that disturbed him more than the usual violence. Later that night, O'Sullivan was having drinks with his partner, Detective James Rodriguez, and they talked about the case. "Almost feel bad for the guy," Rodriguez admitted. "I mean, he's a mobster. He's probably done terrible things to people. But whatever Bumpy did to him, that wasn't just punishment. That was dismantling someone piece by piece." O'Sullivan nodded. "The crazy thing is, Bumpy was in the right. The guy put hands on an old woman, on Bumpy's mother. In their world, that's unforgivable. Hell, in any world, that should be unforgivable. So what do? Rodriguez asked. "We write up the report, we document everything, and we file it away," O'Sullivan said, because Tony Delucci isn't going to press charges. He's going to disappear back to Philadelphia and pray that Bumpy Johnson forgets he exists. And honestly, it's probably the best outcome for everyone. They were right. 3. Days after being found on those precinct steps, Tony Delucci left New York and never came back. Tony Delucci never recovered from what happened in that warehouse. When he returned to Philadelphia, he was a changed man. The swagger was gone, replaced by a nervous, haunted quality that everyone noticed. He quit the mob life entirely, telling his bosses he was done. Surprisingly, they let him walk away. Even the Genovese family understood that Tony had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Kate, and keeping him around would only cause more problems. He took a job working in his father's restaurant, spending his days in the kitchen, avoiding eye contact with customers. People who had known him before said it was like looking at a ghost. He developed a drinking problem, had nightmares that would wake up his wife in the middle of the night. He never talked about what specifically happened in that warehouse, not even to his closest family members. All he would say was, "I disrespected a man's mother, and I paid for it." In Harlem, the story became legendary. It was told and retold, with details added and embellished over the years. But the core message remained the same. There were rules, there were lines you didn't cross, and Bumpy Johnson's mother was the brightest line of them all. The incident actually helped prevent future violence. Italian mobsters who might have, for her part, never approved of what her son did. She told him as much during Sunday dinner the week after it happened. "That boy needed to be taught respect, Ellsworth, but you didn't have to destroy him," she said. Bumpy simply nodded and said, "Yes, Mama." But they both knew he'd do it again, if he had to. The legend of Tony Delucci's punishment lasted long after both Bumpy and Tony had died. It became a cautionary tale told in both legitimate and criminal circles about the consequences of disrespect, about the unwritten rules that governed the streets, and about the one thing that even the most powerful men held sacred: their mothers. And that's the story of how Tony Delucci learned the hardest lesson of his life. Respect isn't just a word, it's everything. If you enjoyed this story, smash that like button, subscribe for more incredible true stories, and drop a comment telling me, what would you have done in Tony's position?